Hi, everyone. My name is Mariana Valle. I'm an MPA student here at Columbia SIPA. Our next panel is Sustainable Urban Infrastructure, Brazilian Climate Resilient Cities. As climate risks grow more severe with events like the recent floods in the south of Brazil, we must rethink how we design and build our cities. Today, we'll focus on how climate modeling can help us understand these risks and guide how we plan and invest in infrastructure. The panel will highlight the role of the private sector in funding climate resilience and the importance of public-private partnerships. Another key point is the social impact of ignoring climate risks. Often, it's the most vulnerable communities that suffer the most. Our goal is to ensure that our resilience efforts are not only effective, but also fair, protecting everyone. Please welcome our panelists. Andrea Coutinho, Executive Director at the Brazilian Center for Climate Justice. Cynthia Rosenzweig, Adjunct Senior Research Scientist at Columbia University Earth Institute. Daniel Zarilli, Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer at Columbia University and former Climate Policy Advisor for the City of New York. And Pedro Suter, Vice President of Sustainability Risk and Compliance at CCR. And our moderator, Thomas Terbat from Columbia Global Centers, Rio de Janeiro.
Good afternoon. So nice to see you again today, and to really moderate. We start most panels the same way, but it's true. They're four terrific people, but and that's in common with the other panels. But what's novel about this panel is the subject we're going to be addressing, and that is the impact of climate change on cities, research on cities, practical needs for infrastructure, how all the manifold disasters of climate change, from floods, hurricanes, once-in-a-thousand-year rainstorms, fires now in Brazil, how all of that, mudslides, and I could go on and on. I don't think I need to, but how all of that needs to be addressed in a climate conference. And it's usually thought that this is adaptation finance, not mitigation, and that's something that government should worry about. But the problem is, in Brazil and many countries around the world, and even in the United States, the private sector is not able or doesn't see the opportunities that may be there but are not obvious. And yet it is, and our panel will get into this as well, that the main people who mostly suffer from climate change live in cities. So there's a strong element of climate justice as well. So this ought to be, a point of mine has been, this ought to be the focus on cities. That is an important part of our Brazil Climate Summit. I'm delighted that it is this year, and delighted we have a great panel with me to help bring out the various aspects of this. You've met everyone already. I'll welcome them again. And perhaps Cynthia Rosenzweig, I'll start with you. Cynthia is the director of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. She'll tell us more about it in just a minute. But Cynthia, the focus on cities, you've been a pioneer in the world, not just here at Columbia University. Why is it that you thought that was an important issue to focus research on? And where are the frontiers of research? What's happening in your research network? What are the issues and areas that are least understood, you think, in terms of looking at climate change in cities?
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me? Yes? Good. I was on the plane coming back from the Conference of Parties in 20-something in Copenhagen, and it was widely felt that the nation states failed at that Conference of the Parties to reach an agreement. I flew back to New York. On the plane were Secretary General of the United Nations, and everyone was very glum. I was not glum at all, because in Copenhagen, I met with the mayors of the cities of the world, and they were focused on solutions to climate change. And I realized then, and there was Jeff Sachs organized, head of the Earth Institute, organized the next day, when everyone got back, moaning and groaning, there's no progress. And I just got up and said, no, cities are the place. They are the actors who are on the front lines of climate change in both mitigating greenhouse gases. Up to 70% of greenhouse gas emissions are either from or they're in their remit of cities. At the same time, cities are on the front lines of climate disasters, the increasing climate disasters that Tom just talked about. So that's why we formed the Urban Climate Change Research Network. It now has over 2,000 researchers worldwide who work on cities. And the solutions in both the mitigation space and the adaptation space. And really, more and more, we're going to be seeing as the challenges of climate change take hold that we're experiencing, as has been experienced in Brazil and elsewhere, the cities are leading the way. And that's why, that's the origin story of our Urban Climate Change Research Network.
Sarah, maybe continue just a little bit more on what you're researching, how your research has evolved over the years, what are the themes that you're looking at now, maybe in terms of you yourself, but maybe the network that you manage so ably.
Well, what we do, we have several major areas of action. Because right now, by the way, we're in the time of climate action. We're no longer in the time of just throwing scientists and researchers throwing things over the fence and saying, "Oh yeah, pick this up." So it's very interactive with stakeholders. We publish. We work with our network to create the assessment of climate change in cities. We're now publishing our third version. It's called ARC3. You can kind of feel that arc over to the solutions. So that's, and we cover though all the different aspects because, as we can see, I know this panel is focused on infrastructure. So we have an infrastructure team. But we also have urban climate science. And by the way, I brought some projections, Tom, for Brazilian cities when you'd like me to read them out of what the urban climate scientists say. But also, one of the cross-cutting themes is environmental justice, because the social aspects in cities are just as important as the infrastructure. So we cover all of the areas because that's in cities is where they all come together.
Good. And maybe just to continue just a little bit more and to further flesh out the vast expertise that you bring us. In New York City, I know you cover the world, but New York City is your home, and New York City is where many of these issues have come to become most obvious. Hurricane Sandy and others, Dan will talk to us about in a little bit. But New York City, you've also told us, is well known for building coalitions and partnerships between the government and the private sector, something called the New York City Panel on Climate Change. Could you talk to us about how New York City, the New York will run through our panel discussion a little bit, but how does that work in New York City? How do the various stakeholders come together and use the funds most wisely?
Right. Well, Dan, we want to really hear from your perspective because I'm from the research science side, and Dan Zarilli was for many years one of the key climate change leader of the city government of New York. So we can talk a lot about, from the two perspectives, government and research, two different sectors. But early on, and I believe leadership, by the way, very important. Leadership is one of the very key aspects in whatever, be it public sector or private sector. It's leadership who recognize that the importance of climate change and step up and say, we're going to do something about this. We're going to get ready. And in our case, it was Mayor Michael Bloomberg who said, this is really important. We are not going to be able to ensure sustainability in New York City unless we tackle climate change head on. And he also turned to he said, we can't do it all ourselves. We need have all cities, by the way, have really good colleges and universities, right? And experts. And we need very much a partnership between those sectors. So that's why Mayor Bloomberg founded the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And here's another, and it's now just starting its 5th iteration. So this is also another key piece, I think, for whatever institutions, organizations we're working in. It's over time. It's not like we're going to solve climate change, done deal, done and dusted, right? Absolutely not. It's because it's changing. Climate change is the second word in the challenge, right? So what we have to be doing is transforming our cities, and so that we can keep learning as the climate change progresses. So those are, I think, I want to hear from Dan from his point of view,
yes.
But those are some of the way that we actually got started here in New York City.
Well, thank you very much, and teeing up nicely. Dan, let's turn to you then. Dan is now the Chief Sustainability Officer. I think that was only created like a month ago right here at Columbia University, so you can tell us all about how the first month has gone and why the university has decided it needs a sustainability officer. But your experience as a teacher here at Columbia University in the climate school, and your background in New York City government in particular. Dan, you reflect back upon the challenges of infrastructure in a city with lots of resources like New York City, and then maybe you also know Brazil, have come to know Brazil much better in recent years, and we've been grateful for your visits to us. What lessons New York City at New York City has to offer to Rio and São Paulo and other large cities in Brazil?
A lot of questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
I won't forget them.
It's a real pleasure to be here with all my panelists, and of course with Tom, and long-term partnership with Cynthia, which I love following Cynthia whenever I speak, because the infectious optimism that comes through is just is amazing. We all need more of it. So I am newly in this role of Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer here at Columbia, and what that means is I'm trying to marshal all of the smarts that are here at the university, folks like Cynthia and across the Columbia Climate School and really all across the university, to help make sure that we are continuing to be a leader on climate change, both on our campus with our energy systems, our water, our waste, transportation, all the things that we do, but also thinking very broadly about all the tools at our disposal at Columbia in order to continue to be a climate leader and to live up to the expectations of a university that has created the world's first climate school. There's so much that we can be doing here. And to connect it, there's really so much that we can be doing, partly because we're in a global city like New York. The media, the financial, cultural capital of the world, means that there's a spotlight on what happens here. And that's relevant, I think, for so many global cities to think through. So maybe more on that point in a second. The work that I was able to do before I joined Columbia at the City of New York really followed its own arc, to use Cynthia's term. Hurricane Sandy was a major pivot moment here in New York City for how we understood and lived the reality of climate change. We had, thankfully, a really great understanding. I would always describe it as academically of what climate change might mean for a city. We had the maps, we had the charts, we sort of knew, and we had even plans in place. What we didn't have was a lot of money, a lot of ability to do things. Hurricane Sandy changed that, because all of a sudden climate change in the popular consciousness went from being something that was 100 years away, happening to someone far away in a different part of the world. It happened here. It happened now. We're living it already. And what it did over the next decade, it kicked off a wave of climate policy that I think is still reverberating here in the city and around the globe. We began an investment program of $20 billion in climate adaptation, flood risk, heat mitigation, all the sort of things that you need to do to make sure you're protecting the people that live in your city. And there's 8.8 or so million people living here in New York City that are experiencing the realities of climate change already. But it also took us down a deep path of decarbonization, something called Local Law 97, where we are decarbonizing all the buildings in New York City. We divested the city's pension funds. We passed groundbreaking environmental justice legislation. It wasn't just Sandy happened and it was a bad hurricane. Let's make sure that the impacts of that hurricane never happen again. It was a moment when we really widened our view and asked ourselves, what else could happen here? And what's really causing this problem? And how do we get to these root causes? And it's something that I think, to Cynthia's point, leadership matters, and the leadership of Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio over the last decade since Hurricane Sandy have continued to show that cities can take up this challenge, can make the investments, and most importantly, can partner with universities, with the private sector to get these types of investments, to get these kinds of initiatives done. And maybe I'll wrap this sort of intro just with a reflection on the New York City Panel on Climate Change, because from the city side, and now I see a little bit more of it from the academic side, of course, but from the city side, what made the New York City Panel on Climate Change so powerful? And maybe one more bit of word on what it is. New York City convened great scientists like Cynthia from across the region to help advise the city on the risks of climate change and what we need to do about it. And what it did is it built long-term relationships between policymakers and researchers so that we could ask the questions together of what problems we were even trying to solve. Gone were the normal days of academics writing papers and wondering why policymakers aren't reading them, or policymakers having an idea of what they want to do already in their head, and they go casting about for backup to support what they already wanted to do anyway. We merged it together and asked the questions of what was important in New York City, developed the research agenda, and what that did is it made the research outcomes policy actionable and scientifically defensible at the same time. And that, over a decade now of partnership between academia and city, it's a real innovation that so many cities, I think, could pick up. But it's not an easy thing to do. It really means, getting into the room together, putting the egos aside, putting the prior relationships aside, and saying, let's solve this problem together, and let's commit to doing this over a long period of time. It takes the investment in time to do that in relationship building, but what it really means is that at the end of the day, we were able to drive billions of dollars of urban resilience investments in New York City that are paying off and protecting our residents. It's a phenomenally successful program that I think so many cities could replicate.
Thank you, Dan. I guess the billions and billions of dollars makes us think, maybe not so relevant to Brazil, but maybe it is, and we'll come back to the issue of financing. Dan, just a quick little follow-up question. And where we're sitting right now is this gorgeous building on the corner of the company campus. Aren't we below seawater, or sea level, where we sit right now? And
well, thankfully, no, we are definitely not below sea level. This is not the Netherlands.
Yes.
But we're close, right? And New York City has 520 miles of coastline, just the city itself. Just picture that. And we are right near the Hudson River. There have been flooding impacts nearby from different storms in East Harlem, here on the Hudson River. There is vulnerability everywhere in the city and in most coastal cities. And it comes from, yes, sea level rise and the sort of coastal storms, but a lot of it also is just the more intense rainstorms that we're seeing. A couple of years ago, we broke the record for rainfall intensity in New York City and had about 2 inches of rain in an hour in Central Park. And then 2 weeks later, we broke that record again by 50%. So we're seeing this acceleration of extremes, and that's playing out in all sorts of parts of the city, including the lowest lying parts of the city.
Thank you. Did you want to
very quick follow-up? The engineers and architects who built this building and this campus consulted with us at the New York City Panel on Climate Change and used our numbers in our projections into the creation of this campus, and including this building.
And seems to be working so far anyway. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Dan. Andrea, let me turn to you as we turn to the focus to Brazil, and then we're going to mix it all up in the second round as we discuss further with the panel. But many of the residents, most of the residents, Cynthia and Dan, and we all know, have affected by climate change, live in big cities. But there's political decisions to be made about which of those citizens deserve most protection against the ravages of climate change. How does this work out in Brazil? And you'll give us your perspective on some of these issues of climate adaptation, taking into account the most vulnerable communities, but maybe not the most politically powerful communities that live in that city. Can you give us a little introduction to your own work, your own very important work in climate justice?
Yes. Hi, Brazil Climate Summit. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm so happy to be here with you all, and also to bring you the climate justice perspective through the adaptation lens. And it's very common when we say, like, who pays the price? Who pays the price first for all the harms that we have in the infrastructures in our cities? But allow me raise other questions when we say that, because first of all, when we say about urban structures in Brazil treated by climate change justice, it's critical and urgent to say, like, who dies first? Who will lose your home? Who will lose your job? Who will be sick first? So how many injustice affects in different cities in countries as Brazil, and how adaptations is crucial for the socio-economic development, thinking in the future and in the present. So I think here we have a lot of perspectives in terms of climate education, and you were saying about leadership. And yes, leadership is key, but we also need an intersection leadership to address all the climate injustice and adaptation challenge in our countries as Brazil. So we have about 8 million people living at risk areas in Brazil. 8 million people. 8 million people that knows that where they live, it's a risk for life. So adaptation is a key, yes, it is a key. But also, so how the infrastructures needs also to be planned with an intersectional lens and for a multi-level level of leadership to coordinate this, but also urgently to implement lens and also some guidelines for adaptation in terms of anti-racist adaptation. So the Brazilian Center for Climate Justice has an axe of research, and we are trying to guide a new generation of data-driven studies focused on the regions in Brazil and trying to map, like, what are the adaptation challenges and how can we raise a new generation of research. Because when we say about academic, and I love what you brought in terms of research, so we need a new view as well to spread the word with a new perspectives of communications through the media. And so what the adaptation teaches us in terms of media and the vulnerable population. So, Tom, it's not just to say about a vulnerable population and adaptation challenge. So we need also a new perspective to go beyond and to implement new models for adaptation lens.
Be interesting. We'll come back to you later, but where you see that has that new mentality has the best chance of developing in Brazil. We'll come back to you on that,
Okay.
or nowhere. Thank you, Andrea, very much for those introductions. Pedro, you have the way to represent in the private sector on this panel. We've met you briefly a few minutes ago. You signed the landmark agreement to purchase of carbon credits on behalf of your company, CCR. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about CCR's work in infrastructure, the challenges that climate change is bringing to you, and just in general, how the private sector can usefully is already being engaged in adaptation investments in large cities in Brazil.
Thank you, Tom.
I ask a lot of questions.
Yes, again, I think we see a pattern here. I don't want to dampen the mood here. I'm certainly not as upbeat as my colleagues. And if quite frankly, I think the problems we have in Brazil and elsewhere is that first of all, private sector is called upon to invest in the infrastructure, the mobility infrastructure in cities. That's the case in Brazil, as it is the case in many places throughout the world. Less so here in the U.S. But the events that we are witnessing, they're not priced in our models. So CCR is the largest mobility infrastructure company in Brazil. We're publicly traded. 90% of our investors are foreign investors. So we all understand the risks associated. So we're very knowledgeable about the risks associated with climate change. But just so we are not pricing. I don't think that the guy next door is pricing. And we are making these investments. We've been making these investments for the past 30 years. And the models, the climate models that our scientists have worked on are showing us that we've miscalculated. We manage that toll road that you've all seen in the news in Porto Alegre, in Rio Grande do Sul, and that was that's a business that we invested back in 2018. We did not price for that event, and so as a result, there will be some negotiations to be had with the government in order to be able to build a more resilient infrastructure, and that discussion must address what Andrea has just pointed out for us here, and we know for a fact that the infrastructure, the way these infrastructures were built, they had never addressed the risks of the populations that are very close by. So when we are redoing this, we must do it in the correct way. We must take into consideration. But we don't have the luxury. A city like New York, you had Sandy. I was here when it happened. I lived here for a while, and I remember the chaos. We cannot just call upon 20 billion and make it happen. This is a country that has significant problems, fiscal problems, our country. So there are other concerns, health, education. So infrastructure is just, back there. So we must find a way to correctly price and organize a way to finance these solutions for the future. And so not dampening the mood too much, the answer is not out there. I don't think we have an answer. I don't think the government has an answer. So we must create these forums like New York created, where the communication, the interaction is very open. It's in the best interest of those who really need these conversations to be made. We need to create these forums and address these problems, and that's what CCR. So CCR, half of the trucks that run in our roads in Brazil, they run through roads that we manage. 1/3 of the light vehicles, your cars, also run. We move roughly 4 million people every day in our subway systems and train systems in big cities like São Paulo, Rio, Salvador, and we manage 22 airports throughout Latin America, from Costa Rica, Curaçao, so and 17 airports in Brazil. So we are a good proxy of the problem, of the infrastructure problem for big cities. If you look at how we are doing it and how we are trying to mitigate the climate change risks, we are a good proxy, and we don't have an answer. So I think we're still struggling to find the best way to address these climate risks.
Very much, Pedro. May I ask you to extend just a little bit, because I know hasn't been the focal point of your business operations in Brazil, but you're very invested in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul. And I wonder if you might describe for the audience on the ground what the damage has been, how in the world Rio Grande do Sul is going to ever pay for the damage done and still do further work to make a more resilient infrastructure in that state.
Yeah, so government has set up a fund to finance the reconstruction efforts, but there is a question of how these funds and when these funds are going to be deployed, and so all the plans, and the airport is still closed as far as I'm concerned. I think the airport is still closed. I don't think it's operating. So you can, it's a city, it's a large city in Brazil. Can you imagine they're functioning without an airport? That airport is a private airport, so it's been It's a concession company. It's a Swiss or German company that manages the airport in Porto Alegre. Most of the roads, the toll roads, are managed by CCR. We are in constant discussions with the authorities of how we're going to rebuild a more resilient infrastructure and that addresses the risks that materialized in this last event. But you know, there's a it's an ongoing effort. The road that we manage, it's open, it's functioning. We are able to, through the efforts of people are working 24/7 to put that road to work again in 7 days, which was quite amazing. If you look at the pictures, see everything was underwater. We built bridges. We had deployed the help with the army in Brazil to make the infrastructure work and to be able to flow the medicines and all the help needed for that area of Rio Grande do Sul. Was not only in Porto Alegre, seeing the disaster. We are committed to do that, and we are committed to make the investments in a more sustainable way, addressing the climate injustices that these infrastructures they help to. Most of the infrastructures that we manage were built without that concept. So we're committed to do that, and I think we've been very successful in having the discussions and making the investments on time.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm going to kind of go reverse order here a little bit, but Dan, I had a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to maybe try more specific. The private sector's role in New York City, Dan, where are the infrastructure projects that the private sector is engaged in? Any lessons for Brazil and the regulatory framework that's been set up? Where can the private sector usefully be employed in building more resilient cities?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think probably a complicated answer because it's so many of the investments that we talk about as resilience, whether it's the flood walls or heat mitigation or expanded drainage networks, they are very much things that do not have natural payback periods. It's not the same kind of investments where in energy efficiency or a toll road where there's a revenue stream that can easily finance. And I think what we run into so often in the resilience space is the idea that, yes, if you spend the money, it will have a payback. If every dollar you spend in resilience, there's probably $6 or more. There's been different estimates of future avoided damages. The problem is you can't finance off of future avoided damages, and so you're stuck in this place of knowing that your investments will pay off, and yet you can't actually find the money to make a cost-efficient investment. The government plays a huge role in this, and I think we were, to talk about the sort of money that came into New York City, we were fortunate that the federal government was able to provide a lot of those resources to us, and we were able to make investments in infrastructure. But two really, I think, important lessons came out of that for New York City. One is that when we were investing in projects or rebuilding, we were doing it in a way that was finding multiple purposes. There was a pretty high-profile boardwalk that is mostly a recreational asset that was destroyed in the borough of Queens here in New York City after the storm. Well, when we rebuilt it as flood protection. And so it became an everyday asset for the community for recreational purposes and walking along the water and just all the normal things that you'd have on a promenade along the ocean. But on that one day a year or one day every 10 years, it actually also functioned as flood protection. So there was a dual purpose, a resilience benefit to the dollars we were able to secure from the federal government here in New York City. The other key lesson became, it was obvious that New York City was not going to get much more money out of the federal government. And so we started thinking, like when we talked about projects, it couldn't just be that we were going to find new money for big projects that were going to help protect New York City. We had to think about other tools at our disposal. And for us, that became codes and standards. So we spend a fair amount of money, and there's a lot of private sector activity in the real estate or infrastructure, so we decided that we could raise the standards on when you build something, you have to build it to a higher standard, much like Cynthia described how Columbia took advantage of understanding the climate science for building this campus. We started baking it into the building code here that when you build, you would now have to either account for the flood risk or deal with drainage in a different way or in a more expanded way given the realities of climate change. So that all the normal spending that you do on a regular basis, building houses or fixing infrastructure or all the normal day-to-day things become part of the solution for the climate risks that we face. And so these aren't perfect, I think, analogs for what may be able to be accomplished in every place, but thinking deeply about the other tools and the regular activity and how to repurpose that to achieve multiple benefits, I think is a really important lesson that can be applied in many places.
Thank you so much, Dan. Cynthia, you teased us a bit with the projections for Brazilian cities, and we do want to turn the conversation back to you and Andrea to talk more specifically about Brazil, but go ahead, please, and just give us what your thoughts are about Brazil in particular.
So we turn to the urban climate scientists who are part of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. These climate scientists are from all over the world, including Brazil, by the way. And this is the set of projections, and I know you have in-house, you're reaching out and you have your own team doing this. But just to give an example, so this is for 9 cities in Brazil. This is for the 2080s, and we took this long time frame because of infrastructure having quite a long lifetime, but I also want to speak to that in a moment after. So roughly 1.5 to almost 4 degrees C warmer than 2080s. So when we're thinking about infrastructure, the materials that things are made of are going to have different temperature tolerances. And we have to be careful to be thinking about that, otherwise using old materials built to, in the current climate or in 20 years ago or 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, for example. On the precipitation side, and this is, we can see how challenging the precipitation, the rainfall, right, is with what happened in Ponte Alegre, because I think it was that heavy rainfall hadn't occurred since 1940. You see, yeah, that's amazing. So you see how uncertain and how sporadic these the precipitation. It's a much more ornery variable, I would say, than the temperature. But here, just again for the 2080s, there's a range. Some projections, the lowest range, are for reduction in precipitation. These are annual, not the extreme events, but then up to 20% more. So again, this is a challenge for all the infrastructure developers, right? Because of how do you deal with the uncertainties in the projections? And then, of course, sea level rise, major risk for infrastructure and vulnerable neighborhoods. Here, 30 centimeters to 72 centimeters, again, up to almost potentially 1 meter of sea level rise. That affects the coastal flooding. Just want to talk about, these are the 2080s, just want to talk a little bit about the time frame. So I think infrastructure and climate change is a kind of a wicked problem because it's sort of by definition locked in, right? Because you all, infrastructure developers, have to decide what they're going to do and then do something, right? But what we came up with in the first NPCC was a concept, what we called flexible adaptation pathways. And that we can't be just saying, oh, in the 2080s, it's going to be, we have to have the materials for 4 degrees C warmer, and then that's going to be it all fixed, and we're ready. Instead, establishing this learning process, monitoring the metrics, what's working, what's not working, and not locking in the infrastructure so strongly that Ponte Alegre could happen again. And here, I believe, I'm going to link to the private sector, which is, this is where innovations come in. This is where radical transformation comes in. There's, you know, we need to rethink how we're doing all of these, all of our, in this case, I'm talking about infrastructure, but also I think, it's a real place for new technologies, new concepts of how these, for example, mobility challenges for cities actually can be solved over time and learning as we go.
Thank you, Cynthia and Dan. Maybe some of the best practices globally. I don't think we're going to have time to get into them now, but it'd be wonderful to hear some of your global experience outside of the United States as well. But we'll leave that for another time. Andrea, I wanted to get back to you and the important issues you've raised. And if you could, please talk to us a little bit again about changing attitudes in Brazil, about what I assume you mean a greater focus on those 8 million people, wherever they may be living in Brazil, and their particular needs and climate. What's happening in that area of policy that gives you hope, and what's not happening that makes you despair?
Yes. So allow me to mention it about recent research here in New York, and they were trying to name areas of risks, and in Bronx, they title by environmental justice areas. And in Brazil, we also have a research that titles the risk areas as sacrifice zones. Can you see the difference of the tone on how we name the place that are in risk, but why? Because in Brazil, if you live in a favela, if you live in a peripheral area, or in Maru communities, or in urban quilombos, you know what does it mean to be in a sacrifice area. And so we are in a country of several and overlapping inequalities, social inequalities, gender inequalities, and racial inequalities. So, but now for Brazil, what we are making efforts together alongside private sector and government and civil society is like to understand that adaptation can save lives. An anti-racist adaptation can save Black lives. And a gender-based adaptation can save women and girls. So that's why to think about Brazil. And let's think about just another example, that in the Amazon region, over 80% of the population lives in cities. And cities are results of economic and political choices. In terms of climate change and climate justice, and let's say, why not we can say urban climate justice as well. So this population trying to survive and living well, it's not more a long-term agenda. So we are talking about the present agenda, but also there is a conflict of narratives. So to me, the mechanism that we have to implement its coordination with information and implementation of infrastructure models that face the inequality and racial injustice.
Thank you, Andre. Very powerful. I wonder if we might call upon you, Pedro. We've talked about this too in your own work, the ESG, you might call it, component of what your planning is. Who are the communities that are most affected by in your own infrastructure work, and how has the mentality changed in your company, a leading infrastructure company, as to how to take into account the impact of your work on those communities?
Yeah, we understand the leadership role that we must embrace as a company that is heavily involved in investing in these infrastructures, and we think we just reframe our whole strategy for 2035, and sustainability is one of our 4 pillars, and sustainability addresses the problems, or hopes to address the problems that Andrea is bringing up here, and so we understand that there's value associated with these initiatives. there is a transaction cost of being a private company, managing a public infrastructure, and we need, I wouldn't say social license, but we definitely need to be very cognizant of the role that we play in these places. So what we're doing is investing in technology that will monitor these events and linked with civil society, not necessarily with the government. So these quilombos, as Andrea put it, these populations will have a better chance. Well, first of all, we need to create a system to better inform them and work with local authorities. This is not a place to have people living at. So all the studies of that needs to take place when these infrastructures are being mapped out, but also when they, with the population who are there, work with them on solutions that will mitigate the risks associated with their presence. And we are investing heavily on what we call the adaptation plan of CCR, and in technology to predict and prevent these extreme, the extreme weather events that we know will happen, to have the impact that they had in Porto Alegre. This is a commitment we made to have these plans in place by the end of 2025. And these commitments will have a dollar, a real sign associated with them. These are investments in infrastructure to shore up these communities throughout our infrastructure. And we see this as a lot of value creation, value added. It doesn't, as Dan just said it here, it doesn't bring an income stream to the company, but it's absolutely necessary to fulfill our goal and as an infrastructure company.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm getting a sort of a non-subtle message that we're out of time here, but didn't see it on time. But I've got a very important issue. I want you to kind of respond, Dan, to the climate justice issues that Andrea, and you too, Cynthia, maybe just a wrap-up minute from each of you. Maybe just kind of how you integrate climate justice thinking into, Dan, city planning. The residents here, we sit here in Harlem, certainly an area where climate justice must be a primary concern of the city. Is it really? And then Cynthia, how your research is relevant to identifying and those parts of the city that maybe in most of need of climate planning, but are maybe not the most politically powerful parts of the city. Dan, just a minute each, if I could. You got to be able to answer that question in a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, I think a powerful example from New York City on this of how we are really thinking about dealing with the sort of decades of injustice and segregation and redlining that led us to a place where when you map something in New York City, you want to map the bad things in New York City. It could be maternal mortality rates. It could be air quality problems, like you name it. It's almost always the same map for a lot of the same historic reasons. And so when we were looking at heat mitigation, for instance, we were looking at the heat vulnerability index maps that we had published. And, of course, those same areas come up: South Bronx, Northern Manhattan, Central Brooklyn, if you know the city. Communities that are more likely to be black and brown, more likely to be living in poverty. And we were trying to deal with heat, and these neighborhoods were serious lack of canopy coverage, temperature differentials that can be almost 30 degrees Fahrenheit higher than some of the cooler parts of the city during a heat wave. And so we were trying to plant trees. And the way that we went about doing it wasn't just to spread out trees equally across the city in some way that everyone gets a little bit of benefit from. We specifically targeted our investment of street trees into areas that had that highest level of vulnerability that was largely a factor of a lot of history in New York City. But those are the places where we invested in street trees to create cool corridors to specifically bring down that temperature differential in those most vulnerable areas. I think it was always a powerful example for me of how climate action and addressing the inequalities that have existed in New York City, we can be doing that together. We can be addressing historic inequities while we're making the city more livable, while we're taking climate action. but it has to be deliberate. It takes leadership, to the points earlier, to make those choices, to say we want a more equal city.
Thank you, Dion. The unenviable task of wrapping up is yours, Cynthia. You can give us a final comment.
Yes, definitely want to share how UCERN really involves inclusivity, environmental justice in our work. It's really, we've talked about, and Adriana talked about the vulnerable areas, but it's also the decision-making part. And it's also a realization that when solutions are developed, that two things. One is they do no harm, but also the process by working with the community groups. So in our urban design climate workshops, which are neighborhood-based, really working with the community groups, listening and learning. And the very important point that has come out from working with our environmental justice experts is that then the solution, it's not just like kind of lip service, it's that the solutions are better because the lived realities, as you're saying, it's the people who are living in those most dangerous zones also have many times the best ideas for solutions. So really developing them together. And that's really what we're doing. We've had the urban design climate workshops in Rio de Janeiro, in the São Cristóvão area, for example, but also in Durban in South Africa, many cities all over the world. And it's that process of working together is what we've found is that then that's the way to have the transformation to true climate resilience that actually is just more than kind of a slogan. So that's how we're working on it with our group. Anyway, it's been a wonderful panel. Tom, thank you for moderating.
Hey, thank you. That's my job. I'm supposed to thank you. But please help me to enjoy in thanking our panel. Thank you. Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you, Thomas. We'll now take a 30-minute break, so coffee will be served here outside and down in the lobby. So come back here in time and enjoy the break.